Great. So thanks very much to the organizers for putting this paper on the program. It's my pleasure to be able to talk to you about polarizing corporations. Does talent flow to good firms? So this is joint work with Emanuele Colonnelli and Thomas Rauter, who are at the Booth School of Business. And it's also joint with Gabriel Ramos, who is a PhD student at Imperial, and Olivia Xiong, who is a pre-doc at Chicago. Okay, so the motivation for this work is that over the past decade, there's been increasing attention paid to the role that corporations play in society more generally, issues surrounding corporate social responsibility, and increasing pressure on corporations to do good, not just to shareholders, but to society at large. And so this shift has brought attention to so-called environmental, social, and governance, or ESG practices into the spotlight. And in the academic literature, a lot of the attention regarding ESG has been paid to, well, how do investors think about ESG? How does it impact portfolio allocation? And can companies potentially lower their cost of capital by becoming green? So we're not going to be focusing on that aspect of ESG in this paper. Instead, we're going to be motivated by an additional literature which focuses on how employees or workers think about which firms that they want to work at. And this is going to be related to issues of what are known as non-wage amenities. That when workers are deciding which firms they want to work at, they might not just be paying attention to the wage. So for example, in urban economics, you pay attention to things like commuting costs. In labor, there's attention to pay to like fringe benefits and how that matters. And in the wake of the pandemic, a lot of attention, for example, has been paid to work from home arrangements and how that impacts labor allocation. So in this paper, what we're going to do is we want to study how ESG practices of large corporations affect talent allocation, and specifically, how do different aspects of corporate ESG attract different types of job seekers. We're going to want to understand the demand, the labor supply part of this, and understand, in other words, what are worker preferences. We're also going to want to then go further and understand, well, how potentially will ESG and the introduction of ESG by firms and how workers view ESG impact labor market equilibrium. Okay, so what we're going to be doing in this paper, we're going to be studying a Brazilian setting for a variety of reasons, in particular that we're going to have access to really nice data, and we're going to be bringing to bear a variety of research methods. Okay, so as I'm going to discuss, what we're going to do is we're first going to use a randomized survey design and a field experiment to estimate job seekers' preferences for ESG. And this is going to allow us to overcome a number of the endogeneity issues that would be present if we used a basic revealed preference design in just worker and firm data itself, okay? But what we are then going to do is we're going to take this randomized survey design and we're going to combine it with matched employee-employer data on the entire formal economy with Brazil, combined with a new firm survey on ESG, and we're going to put all of these pieces together to then pin down and estimate the parameters of a structural model of labor market equilibrium, which will then allow us to perform counterfactuals to understand the quantitative impact of ESG on preferences on the labor market equilibrium. Okay, so the contributions in particular, we are going to have a field experiment. We're going to be asking how much does ESG matter, and in particular, how much does E matter, how much does S matter, how much does G matter. We're going to, in particular, then want to understand heterogeneity. Do workers view these things the same, or do certain types of workers value ESG more than others? And we're going to be thinking about, does it matter if you just disclose ESG, or does the certification matter? And then crucially, as I said, we're going to combine this with a structural model and perform the first equilibrium analysis to understand the distributional consequences of ESG on the allocation of talent in the labor market. Okay, so just to briefly summarize the results, we're going to find that job seekers do indeed have a strong preference for firms that signal ESG practices in job postings. And the effect is large and is on 60% on the order of work from home preferences. Okay, so in particular, we're going to find that the ESG effect is equivalent to 10% of the average monthly wage, and that there is significant heterogeneity in worker preferences for wanting to work at good socially responsible firms. In particular, we're going to find that these worker preferences are strongest for highly educated, white, and liberal individuals. We are going to find that the largest premium is for the E component of ESG, that workers focus mostly on the environmental aspect. And we don't find very significant effects for social or governance practices, and that the effect is twice as large when it's actually a certification, in particular a B Corp certification. Turning then to the general equilibrium consequences of introducing ESG, we're going to find that ESG increases the equilibrium wage differential by 56 basis points, increases total output by 10 basis points, and increases worker welfare by 1.14%. Okay? So this might at first be somewhat counterintuitive, right? So it is increasing worker welfare, but you might have expected that this would actually lower wage inequality between skilled and unskilled workers, because we find it's skilled workers who most value ESG. We actually find the opposite, that the introduction of ESG actually leads to greater wage inequality. I'm going to try to explain why that is going on here. Okay, so very quickly on the literature. As I said, this relates to literature on ESG, which up until now is a lot mainly focused on investment decisions. We're going to be really focusing on an additional aspect of ESG implications for firms, which is their ability to attract talent. And then we're going to be contributing to this literature on non-wage amenities, with a particular focus on an important source of non-wage amenities in the modern times, which is corporate social responsibility and ESG. Okay, and as I said, one of the key contributions which we hear from a methodological standpoint is we're going to show how you can combine employee-employer match data, a randomized survey field experiment, and a structural model, and put all of these pieces together to be able to credibly and in a well-identified fashion pin down the parameters of this structural model. Okay, so what I thought I would start off with here is just a very simple model of labor market equilibrium, and what you'll ultimately see is that the structural model that we're going to write down is going to look very similar to this, but just with some additional bells and whistles to better match the data. But this is going to help us understand how introducing ESG into the labor market economy can lead to increased allocative efficiency and potentially increased wage inequality. All right, so I'm going to take a simple setup, and the labor force in this simple model is just going to consist of skilled and unskilled workers, which I'm going to index by G. And workers are going to have preference over the wage that they receive at a given firm, but they're also going to potentially care about the ESG rating of the firm, whether the firm is engaging in corporate social responsibility. All right, so the workers are going to face the following utility function. They're going to care about their wage. They're going to have preferences over ESG, and there's going to be an additional component here, which is this type 1 extreme value idiosyncratic shock with tau controlling the dispersion. Okay? So standard logit math then gives the probability that they will choose a particular firm. Now, the implication here of this model is that there's vertical differentiation between firms and horizontal differentiation. Okay? So firms can differ in their non-wage amenities, but I also have horizontal differentiation because different demographics can value these amenities differently, and I also have this idiosyncratic term. And this idiosyncratic term is important because it implies that two identical firms, if one firm wages their wage, that doesn't mean that they lose all of their employees, because some people are just going to, for idiosyncratic reasons, want to work for the lower wage firm. The implication of this is it creates monopsony power and upward sloping labor supply curves at the level of the individual firm. Okay? So firms are going to face an isoelastic production function, very simple, and they're going to combine skilled and unskilled labor into some units of efficient labor. Okay? Now, as I said, firms are monopsonistic, and they're going to face an upward sloping labor supply curve, which comes from this horizontal differentiation, taking the overall market wage index, i.e. the outside option of the workers, as given. Okay? So that's where so they're going to have some market power. They're going to have ability to raise their wage, and not lose all their employees, but they're going to take the overall outside option of the workers as given. You can solve this firm's problem, and you're going to get an FOC, and what you're going to get is a standard result that because of the monopsony power, the wage that any individual firm charges is a constant markdown of the marginal product of labor. Okay? So equilibrium is very simple here. It's characterized by the following conditions. Workers optimize across firms according to their utility. Firms set wages to maximize profits, and then market wage indexes, i.e. worker outside options, are internally consistent and need to be generated from worker optimal decisions. All right? So in this basic model, we developed three key theoretical results to show how firm ESG activities impact the labor market equilibrium. First, I'll start with the last one. ESG increases worker welfare. This is not surprising. If workers value ESG, and then I introduce socially responsible firms into the economy, workers are going to benefit from that. Okay, we then have theorem 2.1, which says that assuming skilled workers value ESG more than unskilled workers, and the more productive firm engages in ESG, then relative to a baseline economy with no ESG, ESG improves allocative efficiency and improves economic output. And the reason for this is because of the monopsony power, there are equilibrium MPL wedges in the economy. Okay? And so allocative efficiency would require that marginal products of labor be equalized across firms. But because of the monopsony power, this doesn't happen. And the reason is as follows. Imagine that the MPLs were equalized. Well, because there's a constant markdown of wages for both unskilled and skilled firms, that would imply that the wage would be the same. And because of this horizontal differentiation, then half of skilled and unskilled workers would then work at the unproductive firm and the productive firm, but because the productive firm has higher TFP, the marginal product of labor would then be higher, i.e. a contradiction. Okay, so you get equilibrium MPL wedges, and what happens as you introduce ESG into the economy with this more productive firm doing ESG, it shifts the skilled workers who value it from the low productivity firm to the high productivity firm, thus correcting for the monopsony power and increasing allocative efficiency. Okay, so in this way, ESG actually serves as a corrective against monopsony power in the labor market. All right, so then we have theorem 2.2, which says that ESG increases the equilibrium wage differential between skilled and unskilled workers. All right, and at first, this might be surprising. Again, you think, well, I introduced ESG, the skilled workers care about ESG, skilled workers earn higher wages. Now the firm that offers ESG can offer lower wages and still get workers. That should compress the equilibrium wage differential. That's actually partial equilibrium thinking, and it's not what happens in general equilibrium. So what happens in general equilibrium, I thought I would just give a quick quick sketch of the proof. You can find the full proof in the paper. So the idea here is that in this economy, the total wage bill is a constant fraction of total output. So when you introduce ESG, by theorem 2.1, the total wage bill in the economy increases. Now, what happens is that you have skilled workers that are going from the less productive firm to the high productive firm. So that increases the amount of effective labor at the high productivity firm, which lowers wages at the more productive firm and increases them at the less productive firm. Again, this is equalizing the MPL wedges. So now consider the impact on unskilled wages. There's two effects. You have a marginal effect and an inframarginal effect. Because the unskilled worker doesn't care about ESG, the marginal worker moves from the productive firm to the less productive firm, but the less productive firm is the one with lower wages, so that's negative. There's also an inframarginal effect, where the inframarginal workers at the high TFP firm earn lower wages, and inframarginal workers at the low TFP firm earn higher wages. You can actually show that this inframarginal effect is negative as well. Okay, so unskilled wages are going down due to these two forces, but because the total wage bill is going up, by market clearing, the skilled worker wage has to go up, which actually increases the equilibrium wage differential. Okay, so that's the basic model. Now, what we do is we want to then empirically understand whether this is true. Is it the case that actually workers care about ESG? Okay? Now, one way you could think about approaching this is using revealed preference, right? You basically look at firms and you say, well, you combine quantities and prices, and you look at firms that introduce ESG and don't have ESG and use revealed preference to try and understand whether whether workers are willing to accept a lower wage to work at high ESG firms. And there's actually evidence that's true. Okay, so there's a nice paper by Kruger et al. That uses micro-Swedish data and shows that wages are actually lower at environmentally responsible firms. The problem is there's an endogeneity problem, right? The fact that a firm engages in ESG could be correlated with a whole bunch of other firm characteristics that workers might care about. All right, so what we do here is we're going to use a field experiment to try to understand worker preferences for ESG. And what we're going to do in particular is we partner with Catho, which is the largest job matching platform in Latin America, and we conduct experimental surveys with real job seekers. All right, so what we do is we actually get the entire universe of job postings from Catho. We decompose those job postings into features. Those features are going to have things on the wage, non-wage amenities, job position, employer's ESG practices, and the employer's financial performance. We get all of these features, okay? We get a huge set of features. We calculate their empirical probabilities, and then we calculate synthetic job postings and randomize across all of these features, right? Now, what we're going to then do is then on this platform, job seekers are going to come up and they're going to say, well, I basically want to work in this industry in this location. And then they're going to get a curated set of job posting which matches those. And we're going to randomize non-wage amenity and ESG features and a bunch of other stuff within the set we show them. And they're going to get a set of 20 job postings, and they're going to rank each of those jobs between 1 through 7. Now, what's nice about this design is it's incentivized, okay? Because they understand that Catho, this job platform, is going to use these results to inform their algorithm for the jobs that they actually send them for their real search. Okay, so this follows the sort of principles of this literature as articulated by a Kessler et al. 2019 AER paper, which is that the design should be both incentivized and non-deceptive. Okay, so this is both. They know these are synthetic job postings. They know that we have constructed them from the real data, but they're not real firms. And it's incentivized because they know it's going to actually impact their real job search. Okay, so here's just an example. This is in Brazil. So on left, you have it in Portuguese. And in B, we have it just translated to English. And what you can see is that this is the basic job posting. It's going to have a description of the company. Now, again, it's not a real company, but it is curated from real job postings. So it's going to be a certain description of what the firm is engaged in. And again, it's going to depend on what they told us what type of job they want to look for. It's going to have potentially some information about ESG, as well as potentially an ESG certification. It'll have some additional information about the job, when they're expected to work, where they're expected to work, some on-the-job opportunities for training and things of that sort, what the hiring stages are, and information on benefits. Okay, so we're randomizing across all these features, and the advantage of this, we can orthogonalize all of these features. All right. So the Catho, this survey was fielded between September and November 2002. We received a total of approximately 1,200 responses. We excluded poor responses, and we got a final sample of 1,206. On terms of age, gender, and race, it matches the Brazilian population well. But in terms of education, we have more slightly educated people, as you might expect, responding to this survey than in the overall population. Okay? Now, as I said, this is an incentivized design. Okay? So the whole point here is that we're trying to elicit truthful responses because they understand that this is going to actually impact the jobs that Catho sends them in their real job search. So on that point, we find that 61% of respondents believe that participating in the survey will help them secure a better job, whereas only 6% of respondents don't find the exercise useful. Okay? So what do we actually get here? Well, we find that that there is a preference for ESG firms, for working for socially responsible firms. We find that ESG signals elicit the same marginal interest in a job posting as a 15% increase in the mean monthly wage or a 10% increase in the mean monthly income of our survey respondents. Okay? So these effects are meaningful. Essentially, they're willing to give up about 15% of their wage to work for a socially responsible firm. 10% for our in-sample respondents. Not surprisingly, job seekers also do prefer higher wages, and they prefer more non-wage amenities. Okay, so they're not only caring about ESG, they still care about higher wages and other non-wage amenities. They don't seem to care very much about the firm's financial strength. Okay. Heterogeneity, right? So one of the points that we want to make, which will be important when we think about the implications for the labor market equilibrium, is that these preferences are not uniform across demographics, okay? That there's significant heterogeneity in who cares about ESG in the labor force, okay? And in particular, what we find is that highly educated white and those individuals that are self-identifying as liberal or moderate have the strongest ESG preferences, okay? So it's, again, the more highly educated, the skilled workers, and it tends to be white and those who identify politically as liberal, okay? The one nice thing about our design is we're not only randomizing across ESG, we're randomizing across many other non-wage amenities as well, so we can benchmark, how important is ESG, is corporate social responsibility as a non-wage amenity as opposed to other possible non-wage amenities. For example, things like whether there's an in-office gym, dental assistant, a private pension plan, gym membership, and a whole host of things that we actually see in real job postings. What we find is that, in fact, and this perhaps is not surprising given the world we live in now, the non-wage amenity that people care about most is work from home. That actually emerges as the strongest non-wage amenity that people care about. But once you go after work from home, ESG signals elicit the equivalent of about 60% as much interest as allowing for work from home. Okay, so this is an important non-wage amenity compared to the host of non-wage amenities that we randomize over. And we find that these are comparable to food allowances or private pension plans, but are more important than most of the non-wage amenities that we are also randomizing over. Okay, so in terms of additional results in robustness tests, we do a whole bunch in the paper. As I previewed, we show that ESG certifications have nearly twice the impact compared to ESG signals without certification. So if you actually have a certification, say this is B Corp certified, that increases the effect by double. Okay? So they do seem to care about this might be cheap talk, and they want to see the certification. And then there's a bunch of robustness on different specifications, and if we include the low quality responses. We also find that respondents primarily value the environmental practices as opposed to the social or the governance. It's really the environment that really elicits the most attention as opposed to social or governance practices. Finally, we show that ESG signaling does not impact respondents' belief in their likelihood of receiving an offer. So they're not ranking these firms highly because they think those are the firms that they're most likely to get a job at. I'll just mention as an aside, we have a lot more on this in the paper. We also, after we do this incentivized design, we just have open-ended responses where we ask them, what do you think about working for ESG firms? And what they talk mainly about the environment, and also they do talk about that the reason we want to do this is because of shared values, that we want to basically work for this company because it shares our values. So it's not coming from, well, I want to work for ESG because it's some non-wage amenity they're missing. They really do talk a lot about, in their open-ended responses, in the textual analysis that we do, that it's really about shared values. All right, so in the time that I have remaining, let me try and quickly describe what we do with this survey. So now what we're going to do is we're going to match it to employee-employer match data. We have a database which is called RICE, which Emanuele and I have used before, which is basically employee-employer match data in Brazil. Okay, so it has a bunch of information at the employee level, the wage they have, the times and the firms that they work for, when they work for their occupation, and things of that sort. And we have information on the firm. Okay, so what we're going to do then is I'm basically going to write down a model that looks very similar to the simple model that I wrote down, with just some additional bells and whistles. Okay, in particular, now I'm going to allow for more demographic groups as opposed to just skilled and unskilled. Okay, and in addition to having ESG as a non-wage amenity, I'm going to have a bunch of other possible non-wage amenities as well, of which ESG is just one. Okay, but we're still going to have a type 1 extreme value shock. We're going to have logit probabilities. Firms are still going to have an isoelastic production function that is going to combine the labor of different demographic groups. And one nice thing that we're going to allow is that the skill multiplier for a given firm is going to be firm-specific. Okay, so certain types of firms may be able to make better use of skilled labor than other firms. Okay, so we have a J subscript here. So in other words, firms differ not only in their TFP, but also in the productivity of different demographic groups. Okay, so once again, you can solve this, and you're going to have a firm facing an upward sloping labor supply curve, and they're going to have set wages to satisfy some constant markdown over the marginal product of labor. Okay, so because of horizontal differentiation, you get monopsony power. So what we want to do is we want to identify the structural parameters of this model. All right, so we need to identify the parameters governing labor supply, and we need to identify the parameters governing labor demand. All right, so the structural parameters governing labor supply are tau, the dispersion of the idiosyncratic preference shocks, how much they care about ESG, and the value of these other non-wage amenities. So what's nice is that we can actually estimate the tau, which governs the slope of the labor supply curve, as well as the value on ESG from our experiment. That's precisely what our experiment recovers. And what we then, once we have that, we can then recover the other non-wage amenities using a revealed preference argument as the structural residuals which rationalize the employment shares that we see in the data. Okay, so in particular, the model implies that we can take our experiment, and it implies what's known as an ordered logit. Okay, when you have these extreme one value shocks, you get a specification which is an ordered logit. And once again, you find very similar results to our reduced form results. Okay, which is that individuals care about ESG, but that it's particularly concentrated among white, highly educated individuals. Okay, so the nice part of this is without having to basically get, we don't have to look at ESG firms specifically where we would have an endogeneity problem. The survey design solves that, and moreover, it gives us the slope of the labor supply curve because we're also randomizing across wage in our design, and thus we don't need exogenous labor demand shocks to pin down the slope of the labor supply curve. All right, then we need to pin down labor demand. The key parameters here are the firm TFP, the productivity, the skill productivity multipliers, and the returns to scale, assuming that the TFP is going to follow some standard data generating process. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to calibrate the returns to scale, okay? And then we can recover the skill multipliers by looking within firm, and we look at the wage gaps between skilled and unskilled workers within a firm. That's going to give us a skill multiplier. And then we can pin down TFP and time fixed effects using a standard fixed effects regression once I understand the slope of the labor supply curve, which controls tau g, which gives me the markdown on the wages, as well as the skilled multipliers, which allows me, because I have employee-employer match data, allows me to look within a firm and look at wage differences between skilled and unskilled laborers. Once I've identified all of that, I have everything I need here to simply run a fixed effects regression to recover firm fixed effects and time fixed effects. Okay? One validation check on the firm estimation is we find that TFP is highly correlated with skill multipliers. In other words, this means that the most productive firms are able to make the most productive use of skilled workers, which leads to a sortative matching between high productivity firms and skilled workers in equilibrium. Okay? So this is something that's been shown, for example, in a 2021 AER paper by Lamadon et al., but we confirm this in Brazil as well, which is a nice validation check on our estimation. So then what we do is we construct counterfactuals to examine what happens when we impose ESG on the economy. What happens to the skilled wage differential, total output, and worker utility? Now, what I'm doing here is I'm constructing a surface of counterfactuals, okay? So I'm basically saying I have a TFP cutoff, which is going to say above some TFP cutoff, those firms are going to engage in ESG. And then I'm going to have what is the probability for the firms above that cutoff that they actually engage in ESG. So what's interesting first, I want to point out two things. First, if you look at the skilled wage differential and total output, when the TFP cutoff is very low, what that implies basically is all firms are engaging in ESG, and then there's no effects. Okay? There's no effects on the labor market equilibrium when all firms engage in ESG. And this makes sense in a monopsonistic equilibrium because when all firms engage in ESG, it's not a differentiating factor, so it has no implications on labor allocations or wages. As you increase the TFP cutoff so that now only more productive firms are engaging in ESG, now you have labor market implications. And what you see is that, first of all, it increases total output on the order of 0 to 4%. Depending on the calibration, and it also increases the skilled wage differential in line with my previous results. Of course, for worker utility, workers benefit from the most firms engage in ESG, so here we see a monotonic decline as I increase the TFP cutoff. Now, this just gives me a surface of counterfactuals. It would be nice to sort of pinpoint a more precise quantitative prediction. So in the very few minutes that I have remaining, we'll talk about how we do that. If I want to pinpoint something down here, I would basically need to take a stand on, well, what types of firms are going to engage in ESG and how many of them are? What is this TFP cutoff and what's going to be the incidence of engaging in ESG? To do that, we finally do one additional data exercise, which is we run a firm survey. We now basically go to firms and we ask them a number of questions. First, do you understand ESG? Why are you thinking about engaging in ESG? And what is the probability you're going to engage in ESG within the next 3 years? Okay? And we have a lot of details on how we do this in the paper. I'll just point out that firms are very actively engaged in understanding ESG. 81% say they are implementing some ESG practices. 41% say they are extensively. And they actually point out that attracting and retaining talent, which is the point of this paper, is one of the main reasons that they are actually investing in ESG. So what we then do is, in addition to asking firms, what is your belief about your likelihood of engaging in ESG over the next 3 years, we also ask them the following questions. What are your wages? How many employees do you have? And if I know the wages of the firms of these respondents, right, and I know how many workers they have, that allows me, through the lens of the model, to recover their TFP, their non-wage amenities, and their skill multipliers. I then can regress the their response on how likely they are to engage in ESG on these facts, and we precisely see that it is the high TFP firms with high skilled multipliers that are the ones that say that they're going to do ESG. In other words, low TFP firms are saying that they're not going to do ESG, and it's the high TFP firms that say within the next 3 years we're very likely to implement these things. Okay, and when you do that, what you find is that now allows us to pinpoint a point on the counterfactual service. And we find is that given these firm responses, the equilibrium wage differential increases by 56 basis points. So we do see wage inequality increasing, reflecting the fact that total output is increasing by 10 basis points, reflecting the increased in allocative efficiency and operating as a corrective against monopsony power, and worker welfare increases by 1.14% in wage equivalent terms. Okay, so very quickly to conclude, job seekers in Brazil have a strong average preference for ESG. We find a large degree of heterogeneity across socioeconomic groups. Most respondents, 92%, link ESG signals to importance of shared values. And then we combine our experimental estimates with administrative labor data to structurally estimate an equilibrium model of the labor market. What we find for the general equilibrium implications, our worker utility does go up. It improves allocative efficiency and increases economic output, but it comes at the cost actually in a counterintuitive way of increased wage inequality between skilled and unskilled labor. Thanks very much.